The fire in the grand parlor crackled, casting dancing shadows on Eleanor Whitaker's silk gown. From her velvet chair, she watched the flames like a queen in her gilded cage. She possessed everything a woman in Savannah of 1831 could desire: a wealthy husband, a grand plantation, and servants to cater to her every whim. Yet as the night deepened, a secret rebellion was fermenting within the walls of her own home, a rebellion that would conclude with her vanishing from a locked room, leaving behind only a wisp of smoke and a lingering enigma. Before we proceed, please subscribe to the channel to make my day, and let me know in the comments where you are watching from. The Whitaker Plantation, a vast expanse of emerald green fields and ancient moss-draped oaks, was a jewel in the crown of Savannah's society. The grand house, with its towering white columns and wide, welcoming verandas, stood as a testament to the wealth and influence of its proprietor, Mr. Whitaker. But behind the immaculate facade, a different narrative was being written, a story of oppression, bitterness, and a desperate longing for liberty. The air, thick with the sweet, cloying scent of magnolias, was also heavy with the unspoken sorrows of the enslaved people who labored under the relentless Georgia sun. Their days were a grueling cycle of toil from sunrise to sunset, their bodies aching, and their spirits gradually eroded by the burden of their bondage. The vibrant green of the cotton fields, so beautiful from a distance, was a landscape of agony, each boll picked by hands that would never know the profit of their labor. The moss hanging from the oaks, like gray spectral beards, seemed to weep for the injustices saturating the very soil of the plantation, a silent, perpetual witness to generations of suffering. Inside the main house, the grand parlor was the heart of the plantation, a room designed to impress and intimidate. The furniture, imported from Europe, was all polished mahogany and plush velvet, its dark wood gleaming with a deep, rich luster under the flickering candlelight. The carpets, thick and soft underfoot, came from the finest looms of Persia, their intricate patterns a dizzying display of wealth that muffled every footstep, creating an atmosphere of hushed reverence. And on the walls, portraits of stern-faced ancestors looked down with disapproving eyes, their painted gazes a constant reminder of the lineage and legacy Eleanor was expected to uphold. It was a room of breathtaking beauty and suffocating formality, a gilded cage for the woman who was its mistress. Every object was perfectly positioned, every surface polished to a mirror shine, a reflection of a life that valued appearance above all else, a world where authenticity was a dangerous and unwelcome guest. Eleanor Whitaker, at 25 years old, was as beautiful and meticulously curated as the room she now occupied. With her porcelain skin, raven-black hair, and eyes the color of a stormy sea, she was the epitome of Southern belle perfection. She had been raised to be a wife, a mother, and a hostess, a decorative object to be admired and possessed. Her education had focused on the arts of conversation, music, and household management, all skills intended to make her a valuable asset to a powerful man. But beneath the placid surface, a storm was brewing. A deep, gnawing boredom had taken root in her soul, a sense of unease she could not quite name. She was a prisoner in her own home, a bird in a cage, and she was beginning to beat her wings against the bars. Her days were a monotonous procession of trivialities, overseeing menus, arranging flowers, receiving callers who spoke of nothing but gossip and fashion. The life she had been taught to desire felt like a beautiful, empty shell, and the silence of her own heart was becoming a deafening roar. Her only constant companion, the sole person who saw behind the mask of the perfect plantation mistress, was Sarah Williams. Sarah, a 20-year-old house servant, was as different from Eleanor as night from day. Where Eleanor was all cool elegance and studied grace, Sarah was a whirlwind of suppressed energy and fierce intelligence. Her skin was the color of rich, dark earth, and her large, expressive eyes missed nothing. She had learned to navigate the treacherous currents of the plantation with a quiet, watchful subservience, but inwardly she was a raging fire of rebellion. She saw everything, heard everything, and remembered everything. She knew which floorboards creaked, which doors whispered on their hinges, which slaves harbored secret resentments, and which ones had abandoned all hope. And she was waiting for her moment, a moment when the suffocating order of the plantation would crack, if only for an instant, and offer a glimpse of a different future. The relationship between the two women was a complex tapestry of dependence and resentment. Eleanor, for all her air of superiority, was utterly dependent on Sarah for her every need. It was Sarah who dressed her, who brushed her hair until it shone like polished jet, who brought her meals on a silver tray, who knew all her secrets, from the smallest vanity to the deepest unspoken fear. And it was this very dependence that fueled Eleanor's resentment. She could not bear the thought that this enslaved woman, this piece of property in the eyes of the law, knew her so intimately, saw her in her moments of weakness, vulnerability, and unadorned humanity. It was a violation of the natural order, a crack in the facade of her own authority. Sarah, for her part, saw Eleanor as the embodiment of everything she despised, the symbol of her oppression. The mistress's soft hands had never known a day of hard labor. Her silk gowns were a stark contrast to Sarah's own coarse linen dress. But she also saw something else in the mistress's sad, stormy eyes, a flicker of shared humanity, a sense of being trapped that she, in her own way, could comprehend. Eleanor was a prisoner in a gilded cage, while Sarah was a prisoner in a cage of iron and sweat. But they were both captives of the same brutal system, a system that defined their worth by their relationship to the men who owned them. The fragile truce between them was shattered one sweltering afternoon over a missing pearl earring. It was a small thing, a trifle, a single drop worth a few dollars. But in the charged atmosphere of the plantation, it was enough to ignite a firestorm. Eleanor, her voice laced with the ice of unquestioned authority, accused Sarah of stealing it. "I have looked everywhere," she said, her voice dangerously calm. "It was on my dresser this morning, and now it is gone. You were the only one in the room." Sarah, her back ramrod straight, her eyes blazing with a defiant fire she had never dared show before, denied it. "I did not take your earring, mistress," she said, her voice low but steady, each word a carefully chosen stone thrown against the wall of Eleanor's accusation. "I have never taken anything that was not mine." The confrontation was a clash of two worlds, a battle of wills fought in the suffocating confines of Eleanor's boudoir. The air was thick with the scent of lavender and the unspoken history of 1,000 similar accusations, 1,000 instances of power wielded unquestioningly. Eleanor, accustomed to unquestioning obedience, was taken aback by Sarah's defiance. She had expected tears, protestations, pleas for mercy. She had not expected this quiet, unyielding strength. And Sarah, for the first time in her life, tasted the intoxicating power of speaking her truth, of standing up for herself, of looking her oppressor in the eye and refusing to be broken. It was a terrifying, exhilarating sensation, a spark of freedom in the darkness of her bondage. The earring was later found, caught in the delicate lace of Eleanor's own shawl, where it had snagged when she had draped it over a chair. The discovery was a moment of quiet, humiliating defeat for Eleanor. She did not apologize, for an apology would have been an admission of error, a concession of authority she could not afford to make. She simply placed the earring back in its velvet box, her movements stiff and unnatural. But the damage was done. The invisible line between mistress and servant had been crossed, and there was no going back. A seed of rebellion had been sown in the fertile ground of Sarah's heart, and it was only a matter of time before it would bear its bitter fruit. The silence that fell between them was heavier and more charged than any words could have been, a silent acknowledgement that their world had irrevocably shifted on its axis. That silent acknowledgement hung in the air for days, thick and suffocating like the summer humidity. A silent war was being waged within the walls of the Whitaker plantation, a war of stolen glances, of whispered conversations that ceased the moment Eleanor entered a room, of small, almost imperceptible acts of defiance. A spoon from the dining set would go missing, only to reappear days later in a flower bed. A chore once performed with meticulous care would be left undone. A subtle yet clear message of insubordination. A door, usually kept shut, would be left ajar, creating a draft that sent a chill through Eleanor, despite the oppressive heat. They were small things, pinpricks in the fabric of her authority, but they were enough to fray her already taut nerves into a state of near-constant agitation. Her paranoia grew with each passing day, a creeping vine that wrapped itself around her thoughts and squeezed. She began to see conspiracies in every shadow, to hear insults in every innocent remark. The whispers of the slaves, which she had once dismissed as the idle, meaningless chatter of a lesser race, now seemed to be about her, mocking her, plotting against her. Their laughter, once a distant background sound, now seemed sharp and pointed, a weapon aimed directly at her. She felt like a stranger in her own home, an outsider in a world she had once ruled with an iron fist. The grand house, once her fortress, now felt like enemy territory, its familiar halls echoing with a silent, simmering rebellion she could feel but not see. Meanwhile, Sarah, her heart still burning with the injustice of the accusation, had made a decision. It wasn't a dramatic, thunderous resolution, but a quiet, cold certainty that settled deep in her bones. She would not spend the rest of her life in bondage. She would not die on this land, her body broken and her spirit extinguished. She would be free, or she would die trying. She began to make secret inquiries, to listen more intently to the conversations of the other slaves, her ears attuned to the coded language of hope and escape. She started piecing together the fragmented whispers of an underground network, a secret railroad of brave souls who helped people like her escape to the north. It was a dangerous game, a game where a single misstep, a single misplaced word, could cost her her life. But the taste of freedom she had experienced in that moment of defiance in Eleanor's boudoir was a powerful intoxicant, and it was a risk she was willing to take. The arrival of Clara, Eleanor's cousin from Boston, was a breath of fresh air in the suffocating atmosphere of the plantation. Clara was everything Eleanor was not: outspoken, independent, and fiercely intelligent. She arrived in a cloud of northern briskness, her clothes practical and unadorned, her gaze direct and unapologetic. She was a woman of strong convictions, and one of her strongest convictions was that slavery was a moral abomination, a stain on the soul of the nation. She had come to Savannah for a short visit, a family obligation she clearly found distasteful. But her presence was a catalyst that would set in motion a chain of events destined to change the course of all their lives. She was a secret abolitionist, a member of a clandestine organization dedicated to the eradication of slavery, a fact she concealed behind a veneer of polite, if pointed, social commentary. And in Sarah, she perceived a kindred spirit, a woman of courage and intellect, who deserved liberty. She discerned it in Sarah's posture, in the spark of defiance still lingering in her eyes, in the quiet dignity that even the brutality of bondage could not extinguish. The dinner conversations at the Whitaker Plantation evolved into an ideological battleground. Mr. Whitaker, a man who relished the sound of his own voice, would pontificate at length about the natural order and the benevolent necessity of the peculiar institution. He spoke of the slaves as children, incapable of self-governance, who required the firm guidance of a master for their own welfare. Clara, with her sharp intellect and unassailable logic, would deconstruct his arguments with surgical precision. "If they are children," she inquired one evening, her voice deceptively sweet, "then why are they not educated? Why are their families torn asunder for profit? Is that how one treats a child, cousin? By selling his mother down the river?" Mr. Whitaker would flush with anger, his face turning a blotchy, apoplectic red. "You do not comprehend our ways, Clara," he would sputter, his voice thick with fury. "You arrive here from your cold, sterile northern cities and presume to judge us. These people are content. They are looked after." Eleanor, seated at the far end of the long mahogany table, would listen in a state of suspension, her heart a battlefield of conflicting sentiments. A part of her, the part molded to be a loyal Southern wife, was appalled by Clara's audacity. But another, deeper part, the part stirring from its long slumber, was secretly exhilarated. Clara was articulating the very thoughts Eleanor had never dared to entertain, giving voice to the formless, unspoken disquiet that had been gnawing at her soul. Clara's words acted like a chisel, chipping away at the wall of prejudice and ignorance constructed around her since birth. For the first time, she was hearing a different narrative, a different truth, and it was both terrifying and thrilling. One afternoon, driven by a restlessness she could not name, Eleanor wandered into the library, a room she seldom entered. It was her husband's domain, a place of leather-bound books and the faint, pleasant aroma of old paper and pipe smoke. And there, in a shaft of dusty afternoon sunlight, she found Sarah. She was not cleaning or dusting, but standing before a bookshelf, her back to the door, engrossed in a volume. It was a forbidden place for her, a transgression that would typically warrant severe punishment. Eleanor froze in the doorway, her initial impulse a surge of wrath at this flagrant act of insubordination. But then she saw the book in Sarah's hands. It was a book of poetry by Keats, a work that Eleanor herself had read and adored, its pages filled with a beauty and passion that had once stirred her own youthful heart. For a moment, the barrier between mistress and servant, between white and black, dissolved. They were merely two women, two souls connected by the power of words, by the shared human experience of being moved by a line of verse. Eleanor was astounded by Sarah's literacy, by the depth of her intelligence so clearly evident on her face as she concentrated on the page. She had always known Sarah was clever, but she had never imagined this. In that instant, she began to perceive Sarah not as a piece of property, a tool to be used and commanded, but as a human being, a woman with a mind, a heart, and a soul of her own. A woman who, in a different world, might have been her friend. Yet the fragile bond forged in that quiet, sunlit moment was insufficient to bridge the chasm separating their worlds. Sarah, her resolve hardened by years of suffering and a lifetime of broken promises, knew she could not place her trust in Eleanor. She could not afford to. The mistress's kindness was a fickle, unreliable thing, a luxury that could be withdrawn as swiftly as it was granted. Her life and the lives of those she loved depended on her silence, on her ability to play the part of the subservient slave, to conceal her true self behind a mask of quiet obedience. Her escape plan, however, had encountered an obstacle. The whispers of the underground network had fallen silent. A group of runaway slaves had been captured, their tortured confessions revealing the identities of their helpers. The network had gone to ground, its secret routes and safe houses compromised. Sarah was alone. Her hopes for a guided escape to the north were dashed. Her desperation escalated to a fever pitch when she overheard a conversation between Mr. Whitaker and the overseer. She was polishing silver in the dining room, her movements slow and silent, her presence so familiar that the two men spoke as if she were not there. They were planning to sell a group of slaves to a plantation in the deep south, a place of such brutal, relentless labor it was considered a death sentence. And on the list of names, spoken with a casual, chilling indifference, was her brother, her beloved younger brother, the only family she had left in the world. He was a strong, healthy boy of 16, and his sale would fetch a handsome price. The news was the final blow to her hopes. It was a physical impact, a punch to the gut that stole her breath and left her reeling. She had to act, and she had to act immediately. A new plan began to form in her mind, a plan so audacious, so perilous it took her breath away. It was a plan born of desperation and a fierce, protective love. She would use Eleanor, the mistress of the plantation, the queen of the gilded cage, as a pawn in her own game for freedom. It was a terrible, desperate scheme. A plan that required her to betray the flicker of trust beginning to grow between them, to manipulate the very woman who was starting to see her as a fellow human being. But she had no other choice. She would save her brother and save herself, no matter the cost. The whispers and shadows of the Whitaker plantation were about to coalesce into a storm that would sweep them all away, leaving behind only a legacy of mystery and a story told for generations to come. The quiet rebellion was on the verge of becoming a revolution. Eleanor's transformation, once it commenced, was as subtle and inexorable as the changing seasons. The seeds of doubt planted by Clara had taken root in the fertile soil of her own discontent and were beginning to blossom into a full-blown rebellion against the world she had always known. She started to see the plantation not as a well-oiled machine, a source of pride and wealth, but as a place of immense, unceasing suffering. The faces of the slaves, which had once been a blur of anonymous servitude, a sea of dark skin and downcast eyes, now resolved into individual human beings, each with their own story, their own hopes, their own sorrows. She saw the weariness in the eyes of the old woman mending linens, the flicker of defiance in the young man grooming the horses, the silent, heart-wrenching grief of a mother whose child had been sold away. She began to perform small, almost imperceptible acts of kindness, gestures so minor they would have been invisible to an outside observer. But within the brutal economy of the plantation, they were a fortune. A word of praise for a well-done chore, spoken without the usual commanding edge. A piece of fruit from her own plate, left on a windowsill in the stifling heat of the laundry house. A blind eye turned to a minor transgression. A dropped cup not met with an angry tirade. A moment of rest in the shade not punished with the lash. They were small gestures, but they constituted a revolution in their own right. The slaves, who had once feared and resented her, began to regard her with a new, cautious curiosity. They did not trust her, for trust was a currency they could not afford to spend. But they watched her, their heads tilted like birds, listening for a new sound in the forest, a shift in the wind. Yet her transformation did not escape notice. Mr. Whitaker, his mind already poisoned by suspicion and deep-seated insecurity, saw her kindness not as a sign of a developing conscience, but as a sign of weakness, a dangerous sentimentality threatening the very foundations of his world. He believed control was maintained through fear, and any deviation from that principle was a crack in the dam, holding back the flood of chaos. He grew more controlling, more violent, his rages more frequent and terrifying. He became convinced she was having an affair, that her sudden softness was a symptom of a guilty conscience, or worse, that she was losing her mind, her delicate female constitution finally succumbing to the pressures of her station. "You are growing soft, Eleanor," he snarled at her one evening, his breath hot with brandy, as he cornered her in the hallway. "I see you coddling them. Do you imagine they are your friends? They are animals, and they will turn on you the instant you show them your throat." He seized her arm, his fingers digging into her flesh like talons. "Or is there another reason for your distraction? Is there a man who has turned your head, made you forget your duties as a wife?" His eyes, bloodshot and wild, searched her face for a sign of guilt, his own paranoia, a suffocating presence in the confined space. Sarah, meanwhile, was putting the final touches on her own desperate plan. She had spent years studying the herbs and plants growing in the swamps and forests surrounding the plantation, learning their secrets from the old woman who served as the plantation's healer, a woman whose knowledge spanned generations, a tapestry of African wisdom and hard-won experience. She knew which plants could heal a fever, soothe a wound, and which could cause harm. And she knew which ones could blur the line between reality and illusion, which could open the mind's doors to a world of shadows and whispers. She began secretly administering a hallucinogenic herb to Eleanor, a powder so fine it was undetectable when mixed with her food or drink. It was the root of a rare night-blooming flower the healer had called the dream vine. Sarah would grind it into a fine dust between two stones, her heart a cold, hard knot in her chest. She would slip it into Eleanor's morning tea, her afternoon lemonade, her evening wine, her hands steady, her face a mask of placid obedience. The effect was gradual at first, a subtle shift in Eleanor's perception of the world. A shadow in her peripheral vision would seem to move. A gust of wind would sound like a whispered name. The intricate patterns on the wallpaper would appear to writhe and twist if she stared at them too long. But as the days passed and the poison accumulated in her system, the visions grew more vivid, the nightmares more terrifying. Eleanor, already in a fragile mental state, her nerves frayed by her husband's cruelty and her own inner turmoil, was no match for the potent drug. She began to see things that were not there, to hear voices no one else could hear. The ghosts of the plantation, the spirits of the countless slaves who had suffered and died on that land, began to haunt her waking hours. She would see a young boy with whip marks on his back, standing at the foot of her bed, his eyes full of silent, sorrowful accusation. She would hear the sound of a woman weeping in the empty halls at night, a sound that sent chills down her spine and made the hair on her arms stand on end. She would wander the halls at night, her eyes wide with a terror both real and imagined, talking to herself, to the phantoms only she could see. Sarah, her heart a cold, hard knot in her chest, was always there to comfort her. She would find Eleanor cowering in a corner, her body trembling, her voice a hoarse whisper as she described the horrors unfolding before her eyes. Sarah would wrap a shawl around her shoulders, her touch gentle, her voice a soothing balm. "It was just a dream, mistress," she would say, her own guilt a bitter taste in her mouth. "There is nothing here. You are safe." She was playing a dangerous, cruel game. A game that was exacting a heavy toll on her own soul. She was poisoning one woman to save herself and her brother, and the moral weight of her actions was a crushing burden. But every time she looked at her brother, every time she saw the fear in his eyes as the overseer passed by, she knew she had to see it through. She was like a surgeon, cutting away a part of her own humanity to save the life of the person she loved most. The confrontation between Eleanor and her husband was inevitable. It was the culmination of weeks of escalating tension, a perfect storm of his paranoia and her drug-induced hysteria. He found her one night in the parlor, standing before the fireplace with disheveled hair and wild, unfocused eyes, talking to the portrait of his great-grandfather above the mantel. "He knows," she whispered, her finger pointed at the stern, painted face. "He sees what you do. He sees the blood on your hands." Mr. Whitaker stared at her, his face a mask of cold, controlled fury. This was the final proof, the undeniable evidence of her madness. He had suspected it for weeks, but now he saw it in all its terrifying, humiliating glory. His wife, the beautiful, elegant Eleanor Whitaker, was a madwoman. "You are hysterical," he said, his voice low and dangerous. "You are shaming me. You are shaming our family." He grabbed her by the shoulders and shook her brutally. "I will not have it. Do you hear me? I will not have a madwoman for a wife. I will send you to an asylum, a place where they know how to deal with women like you. You will be locked away, and you will never see daylight again." Eleanor, her mind clouded by the drug, and her body trembling with primal fear, was terrified. The word asylum was a death sentence, a vision of a cold, dark place from which she would never return. She looked at her husband's face, at the cruelty in his eyes, and saw no hope, no mercy. She turned to the only person she thought she could trust, the only one who seemed to understand what she was going through, the only one who had shown her any kindness in this living nightmare. She turned to Sarah. Clara, her visit cut short by the escalating tensions in the house, had one final secret meeting with Sarah before she left. She had seen the storm brewing, the madness in Eleanor's eyes, and the increasing cruelty of her husband. She knew she could not stay, that her presence was only making things worse. But she could not leave without doing something, without offering a small measure of hope in this hopeless place. She met Sarah in the garden under the shadow of a large magnolia tree, the air thick with the sweet, cloying scent of its blossoms. She pressed a small, heavy purse of money into Sarah's hand, a lifeline to a new world. It was more money than Sarah had ever seen in her life, a small fortune that could buy her a new beginning. And she gave her a name, a contact in the North, a Quaker minister in Philadelphia who was a key figure in the abolitionist movement, a man who would help her when she got there. "Be careful," Clara whispered, her eyes full of a mixture of hope and fear. She looked at Sarah, at the strength and intelligence in her face, and saw the future of her cause. "The world outside this plantation is not as free as you think. There is prejudice and hatred everywhere. But there is also kindness, and there is hope. You must be strong, Sarah. You must be brave." Sarah's plan was working perfectly. Everyone on the plantation, from the master in the big house to the slaves in the quarters, was convinced that Eleanor was losing her mind. The whispers followed her everywhere, a chorus of pity and fear. She had become a ghost in her own home, a wraith drifting through the rooms in a haze of fear and confusion. Her beautiful face was now pale and haunted. Her stormy eyes were wide with a constant, unseeing terror. And she had become completely dependent on Sarah, her shadow, her confidant, her tormentor. Sarah was the only one who could calm her, the only one who could make the ghosts go away, the only one who stood between her and the asylum. The stage was set for the final act. A drama of fire and smoke, of disappearance and deception, to be played out on a dark and stormy night. The unraveling was almost complete. The night of the disappearance was a night of high drama, a night when the heavens themselves seemed in turmoil. A violent thunderstorm, brewing all day in the oppressive Georgia heat, finally broke over the plantation, unleashing a torrent of rain and a barrage of thunder and lightning. The wind howled like a banshee, tearing at the ancient moss-draped oaks and rattling the windows of the grand house as if demanding entry. It was a night fit for a tragedy or a rebellion, a wild, elemental chaos mirroring the turmoil about to be unleashed within the Whitaker home. The sky, a canvas of bruised purple and angry black, was ripped open again and again by jagged slashes of white-hot light, each flash illuminating a world washed clean and made strange by the deluge. Inside the house, the atmosphere was thick with a mixture of anticipation and fear. The slaves, who had been whispering about Sarah's plan for days in the secret language of the oppressed, were on edge, their hearts aflutter with a mixture of hope and terror. They went about their evening chores with a forced, unnatural calm, their movements stiff, their eyes avoiding each other, lest a shared glance betray the monumental secret they all carried. The overseer, a cruel and suspicious man named Jebediah, had been watching Sarah like a hawk all day, his beady eyes following her every move. He sensed the shift in the air, the electric tension that had nothing to do with the approaching storm. He knew something was afoot, that the quiet subservience of the slaves felt different today, brittle and thin, like a sheet of ice stretched over a raging river. He couldn't quite pinpoint it, but his instincts, honed by years of enforcing a brutal order, screamed that the foundation of his power was trembling. Sarah, her face a mask of calm, went about her duties with a quiet efficiency that belied the storm raging in her own heart. She had made her final preparations. Each action was a deliberate step on a path from which there was no return. Her few belongings, a change of coarse linen clothes, a small pouch of dried meat and hard biscuits, and the precious purse of money from Clara, were hidden in a tightly wrapped bundle of oilcloth, tucked away in the hollow of a lightning-scarred tree at the edge of the woods. She had said her goodbyes to her brother, a heartbreaking, tearless farewell in the suffocating darkness of the slave quarters. He had looked at her, his young face a mixture of fear and a dawning, terrible understanding. She had not dared to hug him, for such a display of affection would have been a weakness, a crack in her armor. "I will come back for you," she had whispered, her voice thick with an emotion she dared not show. The words were a sacred vow, a promise that would become the driving force of her new life. "I promise." He had simply nodded, his eyes wide, a silent testament to the bond that slavery could not break. As the storm reached its peak, its fury shaking the very foundations of the house, Sarah made her move. She went to Eleanor's room, a small, dark vial of a powerful, concentrated dose of the hallucinogenic herb hidden in her palm. The liquid inside was a deep, viscous black, distilled from the dream vine with a potency that could shatter a mind already teetering on the brink. Eleanor, already in a state of heightened anxiety due to the storm, her nerves screaming with every clap of thunder, was an easy target. She was pacing the room like a caged animal, her hands twisting the fabric of her silk nightgown. Sarah mixed the drug into a glass of water and gave it to her. Her voice was a soothing balm in the chaos of the night, a hypnotic lullaby against the storm's violent percussion. "Drink this, mistress," she said, her expression one of deep, feigned concern. "It will calm your nerves." The effect of the drug was almost instantaneous. Eleanor drank it down without question, her trust in Sarah now absolute. A moment later, her eyes, already wide with fear, became unfocused. The stormy sea within them clouded over, becoming placid and empty. Her body went limp, her limbs losing their tension, her head lolling to one side as if the bones in her neck had dissolved. She was like a puppet with its strings cut, her will entirely extinguished, her consciousness adrift in a dark, silent ocean. Sarah looked at the woman she had broken, the beautiful, proud mistress, now a pliant, empty vessel. A wave of nausea and guilt washed over her, but she pushed it down, burying it deep under the cold, hard stone of her resolve. She was the puppet master now. Sarah led Eleanor, her arm wrapped firmly around her waist, through the darkened halls of the house, her own heart pounding in her chest like a frantic drum. The house was eerily quiet, the other slaves having made themselves scarce, their absence a silent, complicit prayer. The only sounds were the raging storm outside and the soft shuffling of Eleanor's slippers on the polished wood floors. Sarah took her to the grand parlor, the room that was the symbol of her oppression, the gilded cage that had been Eleanor's prison. It was the heart of the Whitakers' power, and it would now be the stage for its spectacular undoing. "We will be safe in here, mistress," she whispered. Her voice was a hypnotic drone that seemed to bypass Eleanor's ears and speak directly to her vacant mind. "The ghosts cannot get us in here." She sat Eleanor down in her favorite velvet chair by the fireplace. The flames from the already lit fire cast a warm, flickering glow on her pale, beautiful face. Eleanor, her mind lost in a fog of drug-induced hallucinations, stared into the fire, a small, childlike smile on her lips, her expression one of serene, untroubled peace. She was in another world, a world of Sarah's making, far from the horrors of the plantation and the terrors of her own mind. Sarah then went to the door, and with a steady hand slid the heavy iron bolt into place. The sound of the bolt clicking into its housing was a sound of finality, a sharp, metallic crack that echoed in the sudden silence between claps of thunder. It was the sound of a door closing on one life and another beginning, a point of no return. She then went to the fireplace and, with a piece of kindling, added a bundle of damp leaves and green wood that she had hidden nearby. The bundle began to smolder, producing thick, acrid smoke, but little flame a controlled, deliberate act of deception. The final part of her plan was the most audacious of all, a secret she had guarded for years. Years ago, while cleaning the parlor as a punishment for a minor infraction, she had discovered a secret passage. It was a relic from a time before the Whitakers, when the house had been used by smugglers moving contraband up the Savannah River. A loose brick in the back of the massive fireplace, when pressed in just the right way, caused a section of the wall to swing inward, revealing a small, narrow passage. It was dark and smelled of damp earth and forgotten secrets. A passage that led from the heart of her prison to a hidden exit in the woods behind the house. It was a passage to freedom. As the smoke began to fill the room, thick and clawing, Sarah took one last look at the woman in the chair, the woman who was both her victim and her savior. A pang of guilt, sharp and unexpected, pierced her heart. Eleanor looked so peaceful, so innocent, a sleeping child in her velvet throne. For a fleeting, terrible moment, Sarah saw not the symbol of her oppression, but the woman who had shared a love of poetry with her, the woman whose eyes held a flicker of a shared captivity. But then she thought of her brother, of the life of freedom that awaited her, of the generations of suffering that had soaked the very ground she stood on. And she hardened her resolve. This was not murder. It was war. And in war, there are always casualties. She opened the secret passage, the mechanism groaning in protest after years of disuse, and slipped into the waiting darkness. The heavy stone swung shut behind her, leaving no trace of its existence. Sarah Williams was gone. Outside the locked parlor, the other slaves, who had been listening with bated breath from the shadows of the hallway, saw the first wisps of smoke curling from under the door. It was their cue. They raised the alarm, their cries of "Fire! Fire!" echoing through the house. a performance of panic so convincing it would have fooled the most discerning audience. The final act had begun. The legend of Eleanor of Savannah, the lady who vanished from a locked room, was about to be born. The cries of fire echoed through the grand house, a chorus of panic and confusion that roused the entire plantation from its storm-tossed slumber. The slaves, their faces a mixture of genuine fear and feigned alarm, rushed from their quarters and into the main house. Their shouts and screams added to the cacophony of the thunder raging outside. It was a masterful performance, a symphony of chaos conducted by an invisible hand. They swarmed towards the parlor, their bodies a wave of frantic energy, their eyes wide with a terror that was both genuine and exquisitely fabricated. The overseer, Jebediah, was the first to arrive, his face a mask of fury and suspicion. He was a bull of a man, with a thick neck and small, beady eyes that missed nothing. He saw the thick, black smoke curling from under the locked parlor door, and, without a moment's hesitation, began bellowing orders, his voice a raw, powerful instrument of command. "Get the axes! Break it down now!" he roared, shoving slaves aside as he threw his own considerable weight against the unyielding oak. Mr. Whitaker, his face flushed with sleep and brandy, arrived just as the heavy door splintered and gave way under the relentless assault of two field hands wielding heavy woodcutting axes. The sound of cracking wood was like the breaking of bones, a violent, final sound that ripped through the storm's noise. He pushed through the crowd of slaves, his silk dressing gown flapping, and stood for a moment, transfixed by the scene. The room was filled with thick, acrid smoke that burned his eyes and throat, a choking, blinding fog that obscured the parlor's familiar elegance. But the fire in the hearth was small and contained, a pathetic, smoldering pile of damp leaves already dying down. It was a fire designed for smoke, not destruction. And the velvet chair by the fireplace, the chair where he had last seen his wife, was empty. Eleanor was gone. A frantic search of the room revealed nothing. The smoke slowly cleared as wind and rain howled through the broken doorway, revealing a scene of eerie, undisturbed order. The furniture was in its place. The porcelain figures on the mantel were untouched. The silver candelabras still gleamed on the side tables. It was as if the room had simply been filled with smoke, and then emptied again. Jebediah, his eyes narrowed with suspicion, moved to the windows. They were all locked, the heavy brass latches firmly secured from the inside. The main door had been bolted from within. There was no other exit. It was as if Eleanor had simply vanished into thin air, a ghost spirited away by the smoke itself. The room, once a symbol of Whitaker's wealth and control, had become an impossible, maddening puzzle, a locked-room mystery defying all logic. It was then that Jebediah, his gaze sweeping the room with a hunter's intensity, noticed Sarah was also missing. Her absence amidst the chaos was a quiet, damning fact. The immediate assumption, eagerly seized upon by Mr. Whitaker and his overseer, was that Sarah was the culprit. It was a simple, satisfying explanation that provided a target for their rage and restored a semblance of order to their shattered world. The slave had bewitched the mistress, used dark, heathen magic to spirit her away. "Find her," Mr. Whitaker snarled, his voice a low, dangerous growl. "Find the girl. She has done this. She has taken my wife." A massive search was launched at first light. The storm had passed, leaving behind a world washed clean, the air cool and damp, the sky a pale, bruised blue. The entire plantation, the surrounding fields, the dark, foreboding swamps bordering the property, were scoured by a posse of grim-faced men. Their dogs strained at their leashes, their guns loaded and ready. They were not searching for a lost woman. They were hunting a fugitive, a dangerous animal that had dared to defy the natural order. They moved through the tall, wet grass, their boots sinking into the soft, muddy earth, their voices a mixture of threats and promises, carried away by the wind. But they found nothing. No tracks, no sign of a struggle, no clue to where the two women had gone. The earth itself seemed to have swallowed them whole. It was Jebediah who found the shawl. He found it in the late afternoon, after hours of fruitless searching had frayed the posse's nerves and fueled their frustration. It was a delicate thing of black lace, a gift from Mr. Whitaker to his wife, a shawl Sarah often wore while attending to the mistress. Its fine threads were a stark contrast to her own coarse linen. It was draped almost casually over the back of Eleanor's empty velvet chair, a deliberate, theatrical gesture designed to add to the mystery and point the finger of blame squarely at the missing slave. It was a piece of evidence so perfect, so damning, it felt placed there by the hand of a master storyteller. The discovery of the shawl was a turning point. It solidified the narrative Mr. Whitaker and his overseer were so eager to promote. Sarah was no longer a missing person. She was a villain, a she-devil, who had bewitched her mistress and spirited her away for some nefarious purpose. The search's focus shifted from a rescue mission to a manhunt. They were no longer looking for Eleanor. They were hunting for Sarah. The reward for her capture, dead or alive, was a staggering sum, a testament to the depth of Mr. Whitaker's rage and his desperate need for vengeance. Mr. Whitaker, his pride wounded and his authority challenged in the most public, humiliating way imaginable, was a man possessed. He interrogated the other slaves with brutal, relentless cruelty, his whip a constant threat in his hand. He lined them up in the courtyard, the sun beating down on their bare heads, and demanded answers. "Where is she?" he would roar, his face contorted with rage bordering on madness. "What did she tell you? Who helped her?" But they knew nothing, or at least they claimed to know nothing. They were a wall of silence. Their faces were a mask of fear and ignorance concealing their secret relief and desperate, silent prayers for Sarah's safety. They would look at him with wide, empty eyes, their bodies trembling. But their spirits, for the first time, were united in a silent, unbreakable pact. They had seen Sarah's courage, and it had ignited a spark of hope in their own hearts. They would not betray her. The story of Eleanor of Savannah began to take shape in the days and weeks that followed. It was a story told in hushed tones in the slave quarters, a story of a brave sister who had outwitted the master and flown to freedom. It was a story embellished and embroidered in the drawing rooms of Savannah society, a Gothic tale of a beautiful, fragile mistress abducted by a vengeful, demonic slave. It became a local legend, a ghost story to frighten naughty children, a cautionary tale about the dangers of trusting a slave, of showing them kindness, of allowing them to get too close. The empty parlor became a haunted place, a room where the ghost of the vanished lady was said to sit in her velvet chair, forever waiting, forever lost. The search for Sarah continued for a time, but it was a fruitless endeavor. The swamps and forests of Georgia were a vast, unforgiving wilderness, a labyrinth of cypress trees and murky water where a person could disappear without a trace. And Sarah, with her intelligence and resourcefulness, with the knowledge of the land passed down through generations, was more than a match for the clumsy, brutish men hunting her. She was a ghost in the wilderness, a shadow moving through the trees, always one step ahead of her pursuers. Eventually, the search was called off. The posse disbanded, and Sarah Williams was officially declared a fugitive. Her name became a curse on the lips of Savannah's white society. The plantation, once a symbol of wealth and power, became a place of fear and paranoia. Mr. Whitaker, his mind consumed by a toxic cocktail of rage, grief, and wounded pride, descended into a spiral of alcoholism and despair. He would spend his days in the grand parlor, the room where his life had unraveled, drinking himself into a stupor, his voice a low, mournful monologue addressed to the empty velvet chair. The gilded cage had become a tomb, and he was its sole tormented inhabitant. The other slaves watched him, their faces impassive, but their hearts filled with a cold, quiet satisfaction. They saw his suffering as a just and fitting punishment, a slow, lingering poison that was the inevitable aftermath of the disappearance. The rebellion had been a success, but its victory was a quiet, bitter one, measured not in freedom but in the slow, inexorable decay of their oppressor. The grand house began to crumble. The paint peeled from its white columns. The gardens grew wild and untamed, a mirror of the decay consuming the man within. The legacy of Eleanor of Savannah was not just a ghost story. It was the story of a world turned upside down, of a rebellion that had succeeded not through violence, but through a single, audacious act of disappearance. Years turned into decades, and the Whitaker plantation, once a jewel of the South, fell into ruin. The grand house, its white columns now stained with green mildew and crumbling like ancient bones, stood as a silent, skeletal monument to a bygone era. The relentless Georgia sun and the humid, clinging air had worked their slow, inexorable destruction. Paint peeled away in long, curling strips. Shutters hung askew from single, rusted hinges, and the wide, welcoming verandas sagged, their floorboards warped and broken. The fields, once a sea of green and white cotton, were now overgrown with a tangled riot of weeds and wildflowers, a testament to nature's patient reclamation. And the story of Eleanor of Savannah, the plantation lady locked in her parlor and never seen again, passed from whispered rumor into the realm of folklore, a chilling tale woven into the fabric of the local landscape. It was a story told and retold, each telling more fantastical than the last, polished smooth by countless tongues. It was told around crackling fires on cold autumn nights, in the hushed drawing rooms of Savannah, and on the sagging porches of rural farmhouses. Some said Eleanor's ghost still haunted the ruins of the old house, her mournful cries for her lost freedom echoing through the empty halls on stormy nights, a spectral lament for a life cut short. Others claimed to have seen Sarah's shadow, a fleeting spectral presence in the tarnished, silvered surface of the mirror above the mantel in the grand parlor, a dark, vengeful spirit forever bound to the scene of her crime. The story became part of the local color, a piece of Gothic melodrama that drew tourists and ghost hunters to the decaying plantation. Their cars kicked up dust on the long, untended driveway as they came seeking a thrill, a brush with the supernatural. They would wander through the collapsing rooms, their voices hushed, their cameras flashing in the dim light, capturing images of decay and imagining the drama that had unfolded within those crumbling walls. It was one such visitor, a young historian from the north named Anna, who finally uncovered the truth. Anna was not interested in ghosts or legends. She was a scholar, a seeker of facts, a woman who believed that the past, no matter how painful or inconvenient, deserved to be known. She had a quiet, determined intensity, her spectacles perched on her nose, her hair pulled back in a practical bun. She saw history not as a collection of quaint stories, but as a complex tapestry of human lives, of power and powerlessness, of suffering and resilience. The legend of Eleanor of Savannah intrigued her, not for its Gothic romance, but for its unanswered questions, for the silence surrounding the figure of the enslaved woman at its center. She spent months in Savannah, immersing herself in the city's archives, the air thick with the dry, dusty smell of old paper. She pored over old records, her fingers tracing the elegant, spidery script of property deeds, tax ledgers, and bills of sale. She read faded letters, their ink bleeding into the brittle paper, piecing together the social web of the Whitakers' world. She interviewed the descendants of the people who had lived and worked on the Whitaker plantation. Her tape recorder captured the faint, distorted echoes of a past still very much alive in the memories and stories of the community. The white descendants spoke of a tragic, romantic tale of a beautiful, mad ancestor. The black descendants were more reticent, their stories fragmented, their eyes holding a deep, guarded knowledge. They spoke of Sarah with a mixture of fear and reverence, a woman who had dared to defy the master and had paid a terrible price, or perhaps had won an impossible victory. It was in a dusty attic in Boston, in a heavy, sea-worn trunk full of old family papers belonging to Clara's descendants, that she found the letter. It was tucked away in a small, leather-bound diary. The paper was yellowed with age. The ink faded to a pale, ghostly brown. It was from Clara, Eleanor's abolitionist cousin, written to a friend in the anti-slavery movement, just weeks after the disappearance. The letter, written in a hurried, impassioned scrawl, told a different story. A story not of ghosts and demons, but of courage and rebellion. It told of Sarah's desperate plan to escape, of her brother's impending sale, of the hallucinogenic herbs she had used to simulate Eleanor's madness, a calculated, desperate act of psychological warfare. It described the secret passage behind the fireplace, a detail lost to time, a hidden artery of escape from the plantation's very heart. Clara wrote of her own guilt, of her fear for Sarah, a lone woman fleeing into a hostile world, but also of her profound, soaring admiration for her courage. Armed with this new, explosive truth, Anna then traveled to a small, quiet town in Pennsylvania, a town that had been a known haven for runaway slaves, a key station on the Underground Railroad. She followed the trail from Clara's letter, the name of the Quaker minister, a single shining beacon in the darkness of the past. And there, after weeks of searching through church records and census data, in a small, neat house on a tree-lined street, she found her. Sarah, now a frail old woman in her 90s, her skin a delicate, paper-thin map of a long and difficult life, was sitting in a rocking chair on her porch, a faded, dog-eared photograph of her brother clutched in her hand. Her hair was a cloud of white, and her eyes, though clouded with age, still held a spark of the fierce intelligence that had defined her. Sarah was wary at first, her silence a fortress built over a lifetime of caution. But as Anna gently, patiently, explained what she had found, as she read the words from Clara's letter, the walls of that fortress began to crumble. The old woman looked at Anna, her gaze sharp and penetrating, and for a long moment, the 90-year-old woman and the young historian sat in a silence that stretched across a century of secrets. Then, with a slow, weary sigh, Sarah began to speak. Her voice was weak and reedy, but her mind was still sharp as she told Anna the whole story. She told of the casual, daily cruelty of the plantation, of the suffocating weight of bondage, of her fierce, protective love for her brother. She spoke of Eleanor not as a monster, but as a fellow prisoner, a sad, lonely woman trapped in a different kind of cage. She confessed the guilt she still carried for what she had done to Eleanor, for the manipulation and the deceit, a moral wound that had never fully healed. She had made it to the north, she explained. Her journey was a harrowing odyssey of close calls and the kindness of strangers. She had found the Quaker minister, who had given her a new name and a new life, but she had never been able to go back for her brother. By the time she had saved enough money, by the time she had found the courage to even try, it was too late. He had been sold to a sugar plantation in the deep South, a place from which no one ever returned, and she had never heard from him again. The promise she had made to him in the darkness of the slave quarters had been a ghost that had haunted her for 70 years. It was a wound that had never healed, a grief that lay like a stone in her heart. "Freedom is a heavy thing," she said, her voice barely a whisper, her gaze fixed on some distant point in the past. She looked down at the worn photograph in her hand, her thumb stroking the faded image of a young boy's face. "It is bought with a price that you can never fully repay. I won my freedom, but I lost a part of my soul to get it. I have lived a long life, a free life. I have had children and grandchildren, and they have never known the lash. And for that I am grateful. But not a day has gone by that I have not thought of him. Not a day has gone by that I have not wondered if the price was too high." Anna, her heart full of a mixture of awe and sorrow, listened until the old woman had no more words, her own tears falling silently onto the pages of her notebook. She had come seeking the solution to a historical mystery. But she had found something far more profound, a human story of unimaginable courage, of unbearable loss, of the complex, messy, and often brutal reality of the fight for freedom. She wrote her book. It was a book that told the true story of Eleanor of Savannah, a story that stripped away the layers of legend and myth and revealed the human drama at its core. It was not a simple tale of heroes and villains, but a story of two women, one white and one black, who were both prisoners of a cruel and unjust system, their lives intertwined and their fates sealed by the brutal logic of slavery. And it was a story of one woman's incredible courage, her desperate, audacious bid for freedom, and the terrible price she had paid for it. The legend of Eleanor of Savannah lives on a ghost story, still told on the moonlit nights of the South, a whisper of Gothic romance clinging to the ruins of the old plantation. But now, thanks to Anna, the truth is also known. The truth of a woman who refused to be a slave. A woman who took her destiny into her own hands, and, in doing so, became a legend of a different kind. A legend of rebellion, of resilience, of the enduring, unbreakable power of the human spirit to break free from its chains, no matter the cost. The shadow in the mirror was not a ghost. It was a memory, a testament to a woman who had walked through fire and smoke and had emerged on the other side, forever changed, but finally, breathtakingly free,